chief at the Oxford County Sheriff's Department, and he tells me that that they're in the middle of some FOIA dispute with Mr. Lantaine.
Guarded optimism talks could result in shedding some light on this unresolved issue.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Turkey went down to the town office here, buddy. How'd that go? Huh? How'd that go?
Well, if you guys don't remember Mr. Lantaine, no? Neil? 59 calls in one day at the office last year.
I do remember that.
Oh, yes.
With his rangeways and the Dean Road and the other roads up there and all that, so I was kind of leery.
We've bent over backwards to give them everything. But there's always another request coming from Mr. Lantaine.
And so we're going to take LD 685 next and welcome Representative Andrews. And that is an act to codify that Freedom of Access Act and Freedom of Information Act requests are not hate crimes.
I appreciate the time switch very much, as do my children who don't want to get stuck in the cold. So thank you. Senator Carney, Representative Moonen, and members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is John Andrews, and I represent District 79 in Western Maine. I am here today to present my bill, LD 685, an act to codify that FOA and FOIA requests are not hate crimes. Now, the catalyst for this bill came from a meeting of the State Right to Know Advisory Committee in November 2022. In that meeting, a member of the board, who is also the Maine School Board Management Association's Director of Communications and Government Affairs, said, "Our great concern with the freedom of access requests our districts have been receiving is that they target gay, lesbian, and transgender students. If these types of targeted FOIA requests are allowed to go forward, and make no mistake, these requests are intended to discourage public support for all students, regardless of their gender identity. It would be a despicable misuse of the FOIA law. Personally, I believe these requests are just another form of hate speech." I found this to be very alarming. People as individuals can hold whatever ideas or positions they want. However, when statements like these are made on a board whose jurisdiction covers the right to know, base transparency in this state, it is important to address them. I felt it was important to submit legislation that explicitly states in statute that these information requests coming from Maine citizens are not hate speech or hate crimes. There must be absolutely no confusion about this going forward. Admittedly, the bill's title is a bit hyperbolic, but that was intentional to bring attention to this issue. It is exceptionally dangerous when government authorities and powerful lobbying associations begin to make moves to classify what requests for information from the public are valid and which ones are not. This must be recognized immediately and stopped before it is allowed to metastasize. Calling something hate speech because you and your organization do not want to deal with information requests is more than being dismissive. It is censorship. Censorship is always bad, but to frame concerned parents, grandparents, and parental rights advocates as bigots or hateful people for simply requesting information is quite pernicious, and it must not stand. I ask you to protect and affirm in statute that FOA and FOIA requests are not hate speech or hate crimes. I ask you to take a stand against censorship in any form and vote ought to pass for LD 685. Thank you for your time, commitment to public service. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Representative. Committee members, are there questions for Representative Andrews? I see a bunch of questions. I'm going to start with you, Representative Reckitt, and we'll work our way up the horseshoe.
I'm just I'm puzzling, trying to understand. Could you give me an example of a request that I'm not aware of what request we're talking about that triggered this fear on or this concern on your part?
It's not so much the requests that are out there, it's the comments of somebody on the Right to Know Advisory Committee, kind of qualifying what is a valid request and what is not. I think that's a very slippery slope. I mean, if the table were turned, I'd be saying the same thing. I worry very much that, the state, capital S, deciding what they're gonna let out for transparency is never a good practice. I think that's why we have the Right to Know Commission. And I think putting something like this in statute would only help affirm commitment to sunshine laws and transparency is basically what we're saying.
Follow up if I could.
You may.
So this was stimulated by a remark that was made by one of the Right to Know.
That is correct. That was a catalyst for this. I was watching it live because I kind of a geek for government stuff. And I wow, I almost had a spit take when she said that.
Yeah.
And then a couple hours later, I was thinking about something else. I think I was doing the dishes and I'm like, wow, if, a person in power can start saying that your requests are not valid for whatever reason, that's probably a very bad thing and a very slippery slope that we don't want to go down.
I'll let somebody
Okay.
else maybe.
Thank you. Representative Kuhn, I think you were next.
Thank you. It would be helpful to have some idea, though, just an example of the type of FOA request that this person was talking about. Are you able to give some examples?
I don't know if she'll be testifying or if anybody on that committee will, but I think you'd have to ask her if she's the one that's kind of qualifying the information. I think any request coming from a parent or even a taxpayer is valid, I would think, unless they're asking for stuff protected by HIPAA or your bank account PIN number. You know what I mean?
I think Representative Moriarty, you were next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have one question and I know I have a follow-up as well.
All right.
Representative, you told us about the comment made at the last November's meeting of the Right to Know Advisory Committee by one person. What did the committee as a whole do, if anything, with respect to that comment?
It's asking me to remember in November, but I think there was a pause. It definitely got heated. It got a little bit wild during that meeting. And I remember it being very charged. And I think that's politics entering into a Right to Know committee, which is probably the thing we don't want to have happen, which again was the catalyst for this bill, trying to prevent state capital S or organizations associated with them becoming the arbiters of what is or what is not a valid request. And I think honestly, with the comments of the Commissioner of Education last week saying that academics are going to take a back seat to teaching postmodernism and critical theory, I think we're going to see a huge uptick in FOA requests, and I would hate to see them dismissed out of hand. Again, that's why I think this is a needed bill to stop a very dangerous potential practice.
Go ahead, Representative.
And
Moriarty.
my follow-up, Representative, is whether you know of any case either before or after last November in which the possibility of a hate crime has been raised as a reason for not complying with a FOA request.
I think that's definitely something we should have answered by the analyst. But again, my intention with this is to nip it in the bud so it doesn't metastasize. I think somebody on a board saying that just once is something that would call for it being addressed, because you don't want other people in positions of power to start thinking that way. But I'd be happy to discuss in the work session if we could find an instance of that.
Any other questions? Did you have a question? No. Okay. Not seeing any other hands raised. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
presenting this bill
Switch over. I
today.
appreciate it very much.
And next, I would ask if there are any legislators who wish to provide testimony on this bill. In favor? Is there any legislator who wishes to speak in opposition? Not seeing any. Is there any member of the public who wishes to speak in support of LD? Blanking on, thank you, 685. Okay, so you just please come up one at a time to the podium and speak. And just as a reminder, we run a 3-minute clock after the bill sponsor. You may begin.
My name is Sean McBrady from Hamden, Maine. I am a podcaster, Maine Source of Truth, and I also am Director of Special Projects with Maine First Project. Through Maine's Freedom of Access Act, or FOA, we've exposed items such as critical race theory here in Maine public schools starting in kindergarten. The 2022 Maine Teacher of the Year pushed a book list where that use daily announcements, prizes, and incentives to push pornography on 11-year-old students. That the Maine Department of Education says that doctors make mistakes with gender when babies are born. Transgender library book displays showing 63 different genders and a taxpayer-paid gay sexuality alliance cult inside our schools. We've exposed hundreds of the horrific K-12 public educational issues and placed these on the Maine Source of Truth Facebook page for parents to review. Parents in Maine are starting to realize the evils inside our public schools, but many here in Augusta don't want that exposure. The Maine School Management Association tried to say that I'm some type of cult leader simply for teaching Maine parents that FOA is one of their most powerful weapons regarding educational transparency. Stephen Bailey and Vicki Wallach at the Maine School Management Association have attempted to bully me into submission, asking simply for transparency, something that parents and taxpayers of Maine deserve since we are paying almost $3 billion for our horrific K-12 public education system. Maine should have full transparency and not willful violations, delays, and games played with abusive charges. The Maine School Management Association is attempting to weaponize FOA because they know it will continue to expose them. This is not about hate speech. It's about exposure of these agencies like MSMA that are simply taxpayer-paid political organizations. I've had over a dozen emails with Mr. Bailey of the MSMA over 3 items that I asked for in my FOA request 5 months ago. How much does MSMA get paid by taxpayers a year? The answer is $627,000 from 253 school districts. How much does Vicki Wallach make as Director of Communications? The answer is $129,000 a year. And how many written records does MSMA have on me, Sean McBriarty? The answer may shock you. Vicki Wallach had 73 pages on me just from her email, and the Maine School Management Association had an astronomical 276 pages on me. So I still don't have those because Mr. Bailey delayed them and wants to charge me $182.50 simply for information on my own name. Taxpayers are being stonewalled by agencies and public schools because they know FOA is the only tool available for parents to find out what's being taught. Ms. Wallach says the requests target gay, lesbian, and transgender students. Never have I, nor anyone I know, ever targeted an LGBTQ student with FOA. She also said, personally, I believe these requests are just another form of hate speech. Quite a serious accusation, since engaging in hate speech is a violation of the Maine Human Rights Act. It's not hate speech, it's free speech they hate. We are asking government-run schools and groups, many of her adding no value to the transparency.
Could you wrap up, please?
Yes,
Your
I am.
3 minutes is up. Thank you.
Yep, paid for by our tax dollars. So I'm concerned Mrs. Wallach has influence as a member of the Right to Know Committee and advises legislators on the FOA statute. I'm also concerned the legislature may further weaken what is already a weak FOA statute. So I asked this committee to pass LD 685 and to do so for the students, parents, taxpayers, and teachers of Maine. FOA is not hate speech, it's transparency.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Committee members, any questions? Representative Hagan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So you make me think. So as a result of what you've been saying, how do you think Maine schools have fared in the last few years on this stuff?
Yeah, thank you. At no other time in our history as a state have educational assessments been lower and the tax dollars been higher. The return on investment in Maine is at the most horrific level it has ever been. And I tell every parent I can, pull your kids out of these schools immediately. They are irreparably broken. In the 2018-19 Maine Department of Education assessments, which I perceive to be the last true educational assessment since they went to NUIA, which was a watered down assessment. For example, in Lincoln, almost 9 out of 10 kids in high school didn't know math.
McBride, I think you've strayed very far from the topic of the bill. If you could just wrap up your answer in a sentence
Sure,
or
the
two.
question
We
was
do have
about
a
education. correct.
germaneness rule. And I should have raised a concern about the question, but out of respect to my colleague, I wanted to give you an opportunity to see if you were going to focus it on the legislation. So if you could
I
just
am.
wrap up.
I'll tie it in.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So for example, 1/3 of Maine 4th graders can read at proficiency, only 1/3. Only 1/3 of Maine 8th graders can do math at proficiency. The reason that these organizations and schools are receiving more FOA requests is number one, people didn't know it existed. And number two, the educational results are horrific. And they are spending more and more dollars, taxpayer dollars, on things like social emotional learning, critical race theory, and a lot of other subjects, for example, transitioning kids' gender, than they are on the basics of math, science, and reading. And that is why, again, the Maine School Management Association doesn't want parents sending in FOA requests because it exposes the cabal of what's happening in our school systems today.
Thank you. Any other questions, committee members? Not seeing any. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you for your testimony. I didn't get the whole sentence, but in the beginning of your speech, you said, people in Augusta don't want to hear what's going on.
For
You're saying
example,
that in the State House,
many of the organizations like the Maine Department of Education, the Maine School Management Association, the Maine Library Association, the American School Counselors Association, the Organization of Social Workers, they don't really want to allow the exposure for what these FOA requests are exposing in these schools because it makes them look even worse. The numbers and the assessments are horrific enough, but when you start diving into things like taxpayer paid gay sexuality alliances in schools, instead of working on math, science, and reading, those folks like the Vicki Wallachs, the director of communications, doesn't want those things exposed. So she calls it hate speech because she can't back up her argument. She can't defend it. She can only turn and try to bully me into submission, which is not going to happen. Thank you.
Representative Lee?
Should probably be a yes or no question. Have you ever had a Freedom of Access Act request denied on the basis that it was hate speech or a hate crime?
No.
Any other questions, committee? Not seeing any. Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
testimony. Others who wish to speak in opposition to this, in favor of this legislation?
Howdy. My name is William Clardy. I live over on the wrong side of the river in Augusta. And I originally didn't intend to come testify for this bill because this is an act that we ought not need. But then the more I thought about it and the more I talked to other friends, the more I felt that, yes, it's an act we ought not need, but one that I think it would do good for the legislature to set out. Because right now, as you've noticed from the last speaker, the school systems are turning into a forum where you're seeing levels of animosity that you wouldn't normally see outside of a divorce court. And anytime somebody is raising questions or wanting to find out answers, the responses are often counterattacks. Mother out in Damariscotta who took issue with school policy, the school board, well, I shouldn't say the school board, but for some reason, Child Protective Services showed up to investigate after she filed a complaint. The school board attributed her complaint to be the cause for a bomb threat hoax. The animosity is out there, and for Freedom of Access Act requests, we should try to keep things focused on what those facts are. Let people actually see what's going on in there without allowing the folks who are insecure about what they're doing and whether it's right, raise up, some counter argument and make accusations where it's a focus on the person asking rather than what the facts are. That's really about all I've got to say on it. On a related aspect, I can say that with election law, when I dared ask whether it made sense that half the residents over at Riverview were actually native residents of Augusta, I was accused of being biased and potentially, harassing or prejudiced against folks seeking mental help. And then got stonewalled from thenceforth on any further inquiries with the Secretary of State, which is not you guys' jurisdiction on this. But it's just, that's how quickly those accusations can quell an effort to ask a simple question. And I wish this wasn't something that felt needed, but I do think you ought to make your intent clear that facts is facts, and let's keep on the facts.
Thank you very much. Could you please repeat your name just because we didn't catch it and spell your last name?
William Clardy, Clardy.
Thank you. I had completely misspelled it, so we appreciate it. Any questions, committee members? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to speak in support of the legislation?
Hi, my name is Mark
Welcome.
Schwartz. Thank you. I'm from Union, Maine, but I spend quite a bit of time here in Augusta doing various teaching. I am in support of this bill for what I deem to be obvious reasons. I think it's important for everybody to know what's going on in the schools. The basis for understanding, if there is censorship going on, it needs to stop. If there's things that are happening that parents don't have consent to, they need to be able to say so. If those parents are unable to make those determinations, then we don't have an education system anymore. We don't have a system that is operating in a way that brings everybody to a higher level. It brings everybody down. And the arguments, as I've delved into these types of, issues and subjects, is that, this is so nuanced. This is so esoteric, I guess, that only an expert is capable of and qualified to handle these issues. And so that a parent may not be qualified to handle these issues, and it poses an obstacle to what is deemed progress. But these people are educators, and if they are truly worthy of the calling of being in that position and hold that position as an expert, then if they can't educate parents and convince them, then they're not very competent at what they're doing. And so they've abdicated that role as an educator if they can't openly engage in the articles that they possess as a means to convince us or their children or whatever case may be that what they're doing is suitable and profitable for all. My hope would be that they would allow for these sorts of things. And the argument then also becomes that if you have this information out there, that there's potential for hate crimes and hate speech, but we already have laws against hate crimes. To have knowledge is not a crime. To have knowledge is to be well informed. And the fact that they hold parents in derision as a threat is a threat itself. And so I hope you guys will consider passing this law, allowing people to be able to speak in terms that everybody can understand. And the only way that can happen is if we all know what we're talking about. And the only way that can happen is if we have access to information. So that's all I've got to say.
Thank you. Let's see if there are committee member questions. Any questions, committee members? Representative Breckett?
I just missed your name at the beginning.
Mark Swartz, SWARTZ. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Is there anyone else in the committee room who wishes to speak in support of this legislation? And go ahead.
Thank you. I think it's only my second time to come to Augusta to speak before the legislature, so bear with me. Do the best I can. First of all, I'm Fran Monroe from the town of Gray, and I've been in the state of 50 years, and I have been an activist for a good part of that time in my town. And usually back in those days, we would request information basically about the school budget or the town budget to be well informed and, take a look at legal bills or whatever the request may be. And we would usually get our information in about 5 days. It was never a formal FOIA type request. And everyone seemed to, be fine. No one abused, as I can tell. And I'm speaking also not just of Gray, but other towns of other people I knew too. And there wasn't really that much of an abuse. The press put more requests in than us citizens over the time. But anyway, and so I don't know when, but within a few years ago, they changed information to be given to the public from 5 days to 10 days. And now it's whenever they can get to it, whoever you're requesting the information from. And so if anything that needs to be changed, that particular one needs to be changed back to the way it was, because it really drags things down. And, it makes it difficult to for us citizens to keep abreast of what's going on in the community. FOIA requests, I guess if you want to call it formal now, FOIA requests are critical for the freedom of information. We do need that in how to vote. All of you sitting here probably at one time or another had been kind of like an activist. You have interest in politics and all. You were concerned about what your school budget looked like or your town budget. And, and try to represent your citizens as best you could, wherever town you came from. So without that ability to be able to do that, I mean, how can business continue on? And the transparency becomes more and more, I don't want to say illegal, but more and more hidden from the public and how their money is being used and spent. And that's basically what it boils down to. How is that money being spent? We now have a whole new arena called the education request that has, changed dramatically in the last few years. But prior to that, it was simple requests on money. So I urge you that you support this this bill, and keep in mind that it should still remain like a basic request of information, so that public can be informed of what's happening in their government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can you just return to the podium in case there are any questions?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Committee members, are there any questions? Senator Lightford?
Thank you. You stated the information went from 5 days to 10 days. Who did that? Is that the school board?
Legislature, the state law. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions, committee members? Not seeing any. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else present in the committee room who wishes to speak in support? Not seeing any. We do have a couple of people online who wish to provide testimony. And so if you're online and you wish to provide testimony in favor of LD 685, please raise your electronic hand and keep it raised until you have provided your testimony. And we'll start with Lori Gaddis Barrett. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You can activate your camera, introduce yourself, let us know your place of residence, and then begin your testimony.
Thank you. Thank you, honorable members of the committee. I'm hitting the start video button and it's not responding, so I hope we can carry on so that the hearing doesn't go too long. My name is Lori Gaddis Barrett, and I am the founder of a parents advocacy group called Parents United Rhode Island. You might be wondering why someone from Rhode Island is dialed in today. And I want to tell you that I was born and bred in the state of Maine, attended public schools in the state of Maine my whole life, and remain a property owner. So I follow what goes on in the Maine legislature to carefully consider the tax impact of the legislative decisions. In October, I attended one of the Right to Know subcommittee meetings that were discussing changes to Maine's FOAA request laws, or they were under consideration. And I gave a presentation discussing the differences between how Rhode Island's public request law is structured versus Maine. And there were some critical differences, but one of the differences that I believe that I had spoken about was here in the state of Rhode Island, no public records can be withheld based on the purpose for which those records are sought, nor can a public body require as a condition of fulfilling that public records request that the person or entity provide a reason. And here in Rhode Island, you don't even have to give personally identifiable information. You don't even have to give your own name, okay? So as a result of trying to attend that October Right to Know subcommittee meeting, I had occasion to have a conversation with Ms. Vicky Wallach, whose comments are the subject of the legislation today, where she repeated to me some of the same sentiments, that she did believe that there was a conspiracy afoot, so to speak, between some parents, and the object of her desire was to limit some of the FOIA requests and look for ways to deal with that legislatively. I did not attend the November Right to Know committee meeting, but I did watch a replay of it. And when I saw her comments, I was reminded of our earlier conversation. And what was stunning to me, absolutely stunning to me, was that there seemed to be a person in a position of authority who was willing to use that role as a weaponization of government against the very taxpayers who produce and pay for those public records that they then seek later. Earlier, you asked somebody who testified earlier if there had ever been a denial based on hate speech or hate speech denial. I can tell you, we are conducting, my group is conducting a study in New England on various problems with different public request laws. We're not seeing outright denials based on whether or not somebody thinks a request is hate speech or is done for the quote unquote wrong reason. But we are seeing in our study several delays and other barriers or obstacles, such as unreasonable lengths of time to respond to the request, or huge, enormous bills for what should be very simple requests. So in conclusion, I consider this a wonderful piece of legislation, and I strongly urge passage. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Committee members, any questions? Not seeing any. Thank you for your testimony. And then is Alan Sarvinas also available? Welcome, Alan. You can please activate your camera and begin your testimony.
One second, let me activate the.
Welcome.
Good afternoon. Welcome. Good afternoon, Senator Carney and Representative Moonen and the members of the District Committee. My name is Alan Sarvinas. I live in Topsom, and I am testifying on behalf of Parents' Rights in Education. Parents' Rights in Education supports Representative Andrews' LD 685, which will codify that Freedom of Access Act and Freedom of Information Act requests are not hate crimes. Parents' Rights in Education attended the Right to Know committee hearing, in which committee member Vicki Wallach of the Maine School Board Association declared certain FOIA submissions are hate crimes or hate speech. This was extremely hard to hear, especially from a committee member, considering the positive influences we have experienced utilizing the FOIA process on behalf of parents, guardians, and other stakeholders. These experiences include, but are not limited to, receiving expanded NWEA assessment data, and which directly increased our parents and guardians' ability to direct the upbringing of their child. Parents' Rights in Education wants to remind interested parties there is no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. In 2017, the Supreme Court of the United States in Slant's case opined our free speech jurisprudence is that we protect the freedom to express the thought that we hate. In a Washington Post featured op-ed, First Amendment expert Eugene Volokov writes that the justices made clear that speech that some view as racially offensive is protected not just against outright prohibition, but also against lesser restrictions. In closing, Parents' Rights in Education is very disappointed in the reckless rhetoric of the Right to Know Committee and the decision to allow local districts to construct even larger financial barriers by increasing the costs associated with fulfilling FOIA requests. We strongly urge the Honorary Judiciary Committee to support Representative Andrews' LD 685 in codifying that Freedom of Information Act and Freedom of Information Act requests are not hate crimes. This will be an honorable and courageous action by this esteemed committee, signaling to parents and guardians for their local engagement that their local engagement is welcomed and appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Committee members, any questions? Not seeing any. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you for your time.
And I would just ask, is there anybody else present online who wishes to provide testimony in support of LD 685? And there are none. And so with that, we'll move on to those who wish to speak in opposition to this legislation. Is there anyone in the committee room who wishes to speak in opposition to LD 685? Not seeing. Is there anyone available online who wishes to speak in opposition? If so, please raise your electronic hand. No, and there are none. And so finally, is there anyone who wishes to speak neither for nor against on this legislation in the committee room? Seeing none, and then online? And there are none. Oh, hold on. We have one person who wishes to speak neither for nor against. there's anyone in the attendee space online who wishes to speak neither for nor against, if you could please raise your electronic hand and keep it raised until you are brought to provide your testimony. And there are none. And so with that, we will close the public hearing on LD 685. Thanks to the bill sponsor and all those who provided testimony.
The chief at the Beauchesne County Sheriff's Department, and he tells me that that they're in the middle of some FOIA dispute with Mr. Lantain.
Guarded optimism talks could result in shedding some light on this unresolved issue.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Turkey went down to the town office here, buddy. How'd that go? Huh? How'd that go?
Well, if you guys don't remember Mr. Lantain. No? Neil?
59 calls in one day at the office last year.
I do remember that. Oh, yes.
With his rangeways and the Dean Road and the other roads up there and all that, so I was kind of leery.
We have provided, we've bent over backwards to give them everything. But there's always another request coming from Mr. Lantain.